So intellectual historians might put the roots of the American Revolution earlier, but I'm going to start with the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, which, as you will recall from last week, was 1, expensive, and 2, a victory for the British, including British subjects living in America who now had more land and therefore more money. Right, so in 1765, the British government was like, hey, since we went into this debt to get you all this new land, we trust that you won't mind if we pass the Stamp Act, in which we place a fancy stamp on your documents, newspapers, playing cards, etc., and in return, you give us money. Well, it turns out the colonists weren't so keen on this, not so much because the tax was high, but because they had no direct representation in the parliament that had levied the tax. And plus, they were cranky about the crown keeping large numbers of British troops in the colonies even after the end of the 7 Years' War. And then the British government was like, you are inadequately grateful, and the colonists were like, shut up, we hate you, and the British government was like, as long as you live under our roof, you live by our rules, and so on. But eventually, the British backed down and repealed the Stamp Act. The repeal inspired a line of commemorative teapots, thereby beginning America's storied tradition of worthless collectible ceramics. But in the end, this only emboldened the colonists when the British tried to put new taxes on the Americans in the form of the Townshend Act. These led to further protests and boycotts, and most importantly, more organization among the colonists. The protests escalated. 1770 saw the Boston Massacre, which with its sum total of 5 dead was perhaps the least massacre-y massacre of all time. And in 1773, a bunch of colonists dumped about $1 million worth of tea into Boston Harbor in protest of British government decisions that actually would have made British tea cheaper. Oh, thanks, Thought Bubble. Now, despite all this, about 20% of colonists remained loyal to Great Britain throughout the war, especially in the major cities that Britain occupied. Also, lots of slaves continued to support the British, especially after Britain promised that any slaves who fought with them would be freed. And it's worth noting that while we generally celebrate the Revolution and see it as a step toward justice and equality, the people who most needed the protection of a government might have been better off and more free if Britain had won, especially since Britain ended slavery well before America did, and, without a civil war. Also, even though most Americans had come to see themselves as separate from Britain before 1776, the British certainly didn't see it that way. They continued to fight either until 1781 or 1783, depending on whether you calculate by when they actually gave up or when the peace treaty was signed. So you can't really say the American Revolution was won before the fighting even started, but the truth is the American Revolution and the War for Independence weren't like this. They were like this. So here's what was pretty revolutionary about the American Revolution. The colonists threw off the rule of an imperial monarchy and replaced it with a government that didn't have a king, a radical idea in a world that didn't feature many non-monarchical forms of government. And if you look at the explanations for the revolution, especially those contained in the Declaration of Independence and in pamphlets like Thomas Paine's Common Sense, there's definitely a revolutionary zeal that's informed by the Enlightenment. And that's especially true if you focus on the idea of liberty, as many of the pamphleteers did. That said, if you look at the actual outcome of the revolution, aside from the whole no king thing, it wasn't that revolutionary. Let's look, for instance, at 2 ideas central to the revolution: property rights and equality. So the Articles of Confederation gave the government no power to tax, which had the effect of making sure that people who had property were able to keep it because they never had to pay the government anything in exchange for the right to own and use it. And that's very different from taxation systems dating all the way back to Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt. And it's probably not a coincidence that most of the writers and signers of the Declaration of Independence were men of property. And they wanted to keep it that way. So basically, the white guys who controlled the land and its production before the American Revolution were the same white guys who controlled it after the American Revolution. But the real seismic change was that after the Revolution, Americans came to view themselves as equal to each other. And in the context of the 18th century, that was pretty radical. Ordinary Americans came to believe that no one in a basic, down-to-earth and day in and day out manner was really better than anyone else. That was equality as no other nation had ever quite had it. And in the end, the ideas of the American Revolution, ideas about property and equality and representation, are still hugely important in shaping political discourse around the world, and particularly in America. And by America, I mean the United States. I'm sorry, Canadians and Mexicans and Central Americans and South Americans. We're provincial, okay? I mean, here in the United States, our presidential candidates must both know how to wear a suit and how to bowl. But the American Revolution also reminds us, as the French one will next week, that revolutionary ideas and values are not always easy to live up to. Nothing challenges one's belief in equality quite like becoming rich and powerful.